14-year-old Rosa, a seamstress in an 1890s textile mill, is framed for theft. Cast into servitude and stripped of her dignity, Rosa finds an unlikely ally in Marta, a wise, retired weaver who teaches her to stitch not just beauty, but truth. As Rosa secretly sells her embroidery to survive, she uncovers evidence of corruption woven into the fabric of the town itself. But when her bold creations expose the lies, Rosa risks everything to bring justice to her community. Will Rosa's courage be enough to dismantle the web of deceit? Or will the powerful forces against her unravel all she's fought for? And can a single stitch truly change a town's destiny? The morning shift bell echoed through the clamor of the textile mill, its sharp clang slicing through the air. Rosa Alvarez, a girl of 14 with calloused hands and a spirit far sturdier than her frail frame, hurried to her station. She could feel the weight of the foreman's glare, an almost tangible pressure, as she slipped her shawl over her thin shoulder. The room smelled of oil and damp wool, and the ceaseless whir of the looms seemed to vibrate in her chest. Rosa moved quickly, her fingers dancing over the fabric before her, stitching with a precision that belied her age. A sharp voice rang out across the floor, commanding attention. "Faster, girls! The patron will not wait!" It was Mrs. Hammond, the mill owner's wife, her clipped tone as sharp as her gaze. Rosa's stomach tightened at the sound. It wasn't the first time Mrs. Hammond's bark had sent waves of unease rippling through her. The woman had an uncanny ability to find fault where there was none. Rosa had learned early on to keep her head down and her stitches flawless. But today was different. Near midday, a commotion began near the far wall where bolts of imported fabric were stored. Whispers turned into sharp murmurs, the words stolen, missing, and worth a fortune rising above the din. Rosa glanced up, her heart skipping a beat as she saw Mrs. Hammond storming toward her. "You, Rosa!" she hissed, her face flushed beneath her powdered cheeks. The room grew silent, the looms grinding to a halt one by one. "Explain this." Mrs. Hammond held up a note, a crumpled scrap of parchment scrawled with Rosa's name. Rosa stared, her mouth dry. "I don't know what that is, ma'am," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. "Liar!" Mrs. Hammond spat, her words laced with venom. "The bolt of fabric worth more than your life is gone, and this was found in the storeroom." She thrust the note toward Rosa, who took a step back, her eyes wide. "I didn't," Rosa began, but her words were drowned out by Mrs. Hammond's dramatic proclamation. "Thief!" The word echoed in Rosa's ears as gasps rippled through the other workers. Rosa's protests were swallowed by the tide of accusation. The crowd of girls turned away from her, their gazes avoiding hers as though her shame might infect them. "Pack your things," Mrs. Hammond ordered coldly. "You'll work off your debt in servitude to the Hammond estate. That is, unless the magistrate decides to send you to the gallows." Rosa's legs buckled beneath her, but she didn't fall. Instead, she straightened, clutching the shawl around her shoulders as though it might protect her from the world's cruel gaze. Later that evening, as Rosa trudged through the cobbled streets of the mill town, she kept her head low. She felt as if every shadow whispered the word, thief. The small room she shared with her younger brother Gabriel and their ailing grandmother had been her only sanctuary. Now even that felt tainted. Gabriel ran to meet her at the door, his face streaked with soot from his work at the blacksmith's shop. "Rosa, you're home late," he said, his voice full of concern. But the sight of her tear-streaked face stopped him short. I didn't do it," she whispered, her voice cracking. Gabriel hugged her tightly, his small frame trembling against hers. "What will we do?" he asked, his voice a mixture of fear and defiance. Rosa didn't answer. She had no answers to give. The next morning, Rosa found herself at the Hammond estate. The grand house loomed over her, its stone walls and iron gates exuding cold indifference. Mrs. Hammond greeted her at the door, a smirk playing on her lips. "You'll begin in the laundry," she said, her tone clipped. "But don't think you'll stay there long. A girl like you will need to earn every scrap of forgiveness." Days turned into weeks, and Rosa worked tirelessly, scrubbing linens until her hands bled. The sting of injustice burned as deeply as the lie, but she refused to crumble. She clung to the hope that her innocence would someday be proven. On one of her rare evenings off, Rosa sat in the cramped courtyard behind her grandmother's house. She had been too ashamed to tell her family the full truth, fearing it would break what little strength they had left. "Rosa," came a soft voice, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Marta, the elderly neighbor who had been like a second grandmother to her. Marta shuffled toward her, carrying a basket of mending. Her hands, gnarled with age, were steady as she began stitching a tear in a garment. "You've got skill, child," Marta said, nodding toward the embroidery Rosa had taken up as a distraction from her troubles. "It's a gift," Rosa smiled faintly. "It doesn't feel like a gift, just something to pass the time." Marta's sharp eyes softened. "Gifts often reveal their purpose when we least expect it," she said cryptically, handing Rosa a scrap of fabric. "Try this stitch. It's called the weaver's thread, strong as a promise and just as hard to break." Rosa didn't know then that those lessons in embroidery would soon weave a path toward her redemption. Nor did she realize that Marta's wisdom was not born of idle kindness, but of a past steeped in secrets that might hold the key to unraveling Mrs. Hammond's lies. For now, all Rosa could do was sew, thread by thread, stitch by stitch, pouring her hope into the patterns, even as the shadow of injustice loomed large over her life. Days turned into weeks, and Rosa's body grew accustomed to the grueling demands of servitude in the Hammond estate. The grandeur of the household, with its gilded mirrors and polished mahogany floors, offered no comfort. Every corner seemed to hold the cold scrutiny of Mrs. Hammond, whose presence was a constant reminder of Rosa's unjust fate. At night, Rosa lay awake on the narrow cot tucked away in the servants' quarters. The faint murmur of the town's clock tower reminded her of the freedom she had lost. But it was not despair that filled her chest. It was something deeper, fiercer, a smoldering determination to prove her innocence. One crisp morning, Marta appeared at Rosa's grandmother's door with a basket of bread. The two women exchanged greetings, their voices low as they talked of the mill's gossip and the hardships that plagued their community. Marta's gaze shifted toward Rosa's room, where scraps of embroidered fabric lay scattered on the bed. "She's got a talent," Marta murmured, picking up a piece with a delicate floral pattern. "It's more than skill. It's her soul in every stitch." Grandmother Alvarez nodded, her eyes glassy. "She's carrying more than a child her age should. If only she'd let me help, but she's protecting you," Marta said softly. "That's what children do when the world demands too much of them." Marta left shortly after, but not before placing one of Rosa's pieces in her pocket, a quiet act of hope. Back at the Hammond estate, Rosa's routine was interrupted by a summon. Mrs. Hammond had decided Rosa would serve tea during a meeting with her social circle, a gathering of finely dressed women whose painted smiles masked an undercurrent of tension. Rosa moved carefully, balancing the silver tray in her hands. As she poured the tea, snippets of conversation reached her ears. "The merchants are grumbling about shortages," one woman said, her lace gloves tapping against the table. "They say the shipments from overseas are being redirected." Mrs. Hammond's laughter rang out, brittle and sharp. "Oh, rumors! Surely the men in charge of the docks wouldn't dare meddle with something so important." Rosa's hand faltered, spilling a few drops of tea onto the saucer. Mrs. Hammond's eyes narrowed, her expression darkening. Rosa murmured an apology and quickly retreated to the kitchen, her cheeks burning with humiliation. That evening, Marta came by the estate under the guise of delivering fresh herbs to the cook. She found Rosa by the kitchen door, her hands trembling as she kneaded dough. "Your stitching is wasted here," Marta said, pulling a small bundle from her basket. Inside were Rosa's embroidered scraps, now turned into delicate handkerchiefs. "Sell these. You'll earn enough to keep your family afloat while you work to clear your name." Rosa hesitated. "If Mrs. Hammond finds out—" "She won't," Marta interrupted, her voice firm. "Let me handle the selling. You keep creating." The arrangement was made in hushed whispers. Each week, Marta would take Rosa's work to the market, slipping the coins earned into the hollow of a tree near Rosa's home. Weeks passed, and Rosa's embroidery began to garner attention. The intricate design spoke of a quiet strength, and whispers of the mysterious artisan spread through the town. Marta, careful to remain anonymous, wove a story of a young widow creating beauty to survive. One chilly evening, Marta handed Rosa a piece of parchment. "This was tucked into one of your handkerchiefs. A merchant's wife wants more. She says your patterns remind her of something she saw in the East Indies." Rosa stared at the note, her heart pounding. The compliment was bittersweet. "If only I could make my work mean more than survival," she whispered. Marta's hand rested gently on her shoulder. "Every stitch you sew is a step towards something greater, Rosa. Trust it." As winter deepened, the atmosphere in the Hammond estate grew tense. Mrs. Hammond's temper flared more often, and whispers of financial troubles reached even the servants. One evening, Rosa overheard Mrs. Hammond arguing with her husband in the parlor. "You think I don't know what you've done?" Mr. Hammond's voice was low, but edged with fury. "The missing fabric? The false accounts? How long do you think you can keep this from the magistrate? You'll ruin us if you keep prattling like this," Mrs. Hammond hissed. "Do you think I care about the mill girls? That little thief was a gift. I needed a scapegoat, and she was perfect." Rosa's breath caught in her throat. She pressed herself against the wall, her mind racing. This was the confirmation she had been waiting for. But what could she do with it? Her word alone would mean nothing against the powerful Mrs. Hammond. Later that night, Rosa confided in Marta. She admitted it. "She framed me." Marta's eyes darkened, her gnarled hands clenching into fists. "Then we'll find proof, real proof. It's time for you to embroider your truth, Rosa." "What do you mean?" Rosa asked, confused. Marta reached into her basket, pulling out a length of fine linen. "The merchants' wives adore your work, yes? Start a tapestry. Weave the patterns you've seen. Mrs. Hammond's crest, the symbols from the ledgers she keeps. You're not just sewing stitches anymore, you're telling a story." That night, under the dim light of a single candle, Rosa began to work. Every thread she pulled was a rebellion, every pattern a secret unveiled. She didn't yet know what would come of her efforts, but for the first time in weeks, hope coursed through her veins. The tapestry grew slowly, each section revealing something new. Marta provided guidance, her sharp eye catching the details that would resonate with those who knew the truth. And all the while, Mrs. Hammond remained blissfully unaware of the quiet revolution brewing under her own roof. The tapestry grew in secret, each thread imbued with Rosa's unyielding determination. Her hands worked tirelessly in the flickering glow of candlelight, guided by Marta's steady wisdom. The older woman's encouragement came in quiet, deliberate words. "A stitch can say what a tongue cannot." Rosa took these lessons to heart, pouring every injustice, every fragment of overheard conversation into the patterns emerging before her. The tapestry was unlike anything Rosa had ever created. The centerpiece was a delicate rose, symbolizing her name and innocence, surrounded by swirling vines that wove together clues. The Hammond crest, a merchant ship, and a faint replica of the missing bolt of fabric. Hidden among the ornate design were numbers and letters Marta helped her decipher, details gleaned from ledgers Mrs. Hammond thought no one else could read. By day, Rosa endured Mrs. Hammond's sharp commands and biting criticisms, but her spirit remained unbroken, bolstered by the quiet victories of her embroidery. Marta's clandestine trips to the market brought a steady trickle of coins, enough to keep her family fed through the harsh winter. Yet, as the tapestry neared completion, Rosa knew it wasn't just a means of survival, it was a weapon. One evening, Marta brought news that sent a chill through Rosa. "The magistrate will be attending the Hammond ball next month," she said, her tone low. "It's your chance to reveal the truth." Rosa's needle paused mid-stitch. "How? They won't let someone like me into the ball." Marta's lips curved into a sly smile. "Leave that to me." In the weeks leading up to the ball, Marta set her plan into motion. Using her network of trusted townsfolk, merchants' wives who had admired Rosa's work, she arranged for the tapestry to be smuggled into the Hammond estate under the guise of a decorative commission. "It will hang in the ballroom," Marta explained as she and Rosa worked to complete the final stitches. "By the time anyone realizes what it truly is, the truth will already be in plain sight." Rosa's heart raced at the thought. The tapestry, with all its hidden messages, would expose Mrs. Hammond's schemes to the magistrate and the town's most influential figures. It was a bold plan, but boldness was all they had left. The day of the ball arrived, and the Hammond estate buzzed with preparations. Rosa worked alongside the other servants, polishing silver and arranging flowers, all while suppressing the gnawing anxiety that threatened to overtake her. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the estate transformed into a glittering spectacle. The ballroom glowed with candlelight, its walls adorned with silks and garlands, and there, hanging prominently for all to see, was Rosa's tapestry. Guests admired the intricate embroidery, marveling at the craftsmanship. Rosa, stationed discreetly near the kitchen, watched as the magistrate himself paused to examine the piece. She could see his brow furrow as his eyes traced the patterns, lingering on the symbols she had stitched with such care. As the evening progressed, Rosa's nerves sharpened to a breaking point. She longed to run, to hide from the consequences of her boldness, but Marta's words echoed in her mind. A truth hidden is a truth wasted. Then it happened. A murmur rippled through the crowd, growing louder as more guests turned their attention to the tapestry. Whispers turned to exclamations, and soon the magistrate called for silence. "Mrs. Hammond," he said, his voice carrying through the room, "this tapestry, it appears to depict accounts, ships. Explain yourself." Mrs. Hammond's expression twisted into something between confusion and rage. "It's nonsense, just a decorative piece," she sputtered. But the magistrate was unconvinced. He pointed to a section of the embroidery that mirrored the ledgers Rosa had seen, complete with dates and sums that matched the missing goods. "This is no decoration," the magistrate declared. "This is evidence." The room fell deathly silent as the weight of his words settled over the gathering. Mrs. Hammond's face drained of color, and Rosa, hidden in the shadows, clenched her fists to keep her composure. Her heart pounded as she waited for what would come next. Mrs. Hammond tried to redirect the scrutiny. "It's a mistake, a coincidence," she cried, her voice rising in desperation. "The girl who stitched this, she's a thief and a liar." The magistrate's gaze turned cold. "Bring the girl here." Rosa stepped forward, her legs trembling but her chin held high. Gasps filled the room as the finely dressed guests took in the sight of her. Thin, tired, but unyielding, Mrs. Hammond sneered. "This is the one you trust? A servant?" Rosa's voice, steady and clear, cut through the tension. "I am no thief," she said. "Everything I stitched came from what I saw, what I overheard. Your ledgers, your words, your actions." She turned to the magistrate, her gaze unwavering. "Search her books. You'll find the truth." The magistrate ordered an immediate inspection. Servants scurried to retrieve Mrs. Hammond's records, and as the evidence mounted, the air in the ballroom grew heavier. Rosa watched as the threads of lies unraveled before her, the once powerful woman shrinking under the weight of her exposed deceit. "You'll pay for this!" Mrs. Hammond spat at Rosa, her voice cracking. But Rosa didn't flinch. For the first time in months, she felt the weight on her shoulders begin to lift. By the end of the night, Mrs. Hammond's schemes were laid bare. The magistrate ordered her to stand trial, and the guests, who had once turned their backs on Rosa, now looked at her with a mixture of awe and shame. As Rosa left the ballroom, Marta was waiting for her outside. The older woman's eyes gleamed with pride. "You did it, child." "No," Rosa said, her voice soft but resolute. "We did it." In the days following the Hammond ball, the mill town buzzed with the news of Mrs. Hammond's downfall. The revelation of her fraudulent dealings and cruel scapegoating of Rosa sent shockwaves through the community. Whispers about the young seamstress and her extraordinary tapestry traveled far and wide, transforming her from an invisible servant to an unlikely heroine. Yet Rosa's journey was far from over. Though Mrs. Hammond had been stripped of her influence, her husband, Mr. Hammond, remained in control of the textile mill. Rosa's innocence may have been proven, but the mill owner viewed her as a lingering reminder of his wife's disgrace. He forbade her return to her old job and spread quiet rumors to ensure no other factory would hire her. Rosa's embroidery was her only lifeline, and even that carried risks. "You've unsettled powerful people," Marta warned as they worked on a new tapestry. "They'll try to silence you, Rosa. You must be careful." Rosa nodded, her hands steady as she threaded her needle. "I won't stop. I've seen what silence costs." One evening, as Rosa walked home from the market, her basket of embroidery tucked under her arm, she noticed a shadow trailing her through the narrow, cobbled streets. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding, but the shadow kept pace. It wasn't until she reached the courtyard behind her grandmother's house that the figure stepped into the light. "Gabriel?" Rosa gasped, her younger brother's familiar face coming into view. But his expression was grave. "I saw someone watching you in the market," he said, his voice tight. "A man, one of the foremen from the mill. He followed you for blocks." Rosa's stomach churned. "Why would he—" "They're afraid of what else you know," Gabriel interrupted. "What else you might expose." The next day, Rosa confided in Marta. The older woman listened intently, her brow furrowed in thought. "They think they can intimidate you," Marta said, "but fear only works if you let it. We'll make them regret underestimating you." "How?" Rosa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marta smiled, a glint of mischief in her eyes. "By showing them you're not alone." Marta's plan unfolded in two parts. First, she enlisted the help of the merchants' wives who had supported Rosa's work. These women, many of whom had grown disillusioned with the Hammonds' arrogance, agreed to showcase Rosa's embroidery in their shops and homes. Her tapestries became symbols of resistance, their hidden messages a quiet rebellion against the oppressive powers of the mill. Second, Marta introduced Rosa to a group of mill workers who had long suffered under the Hammonds' harsh policies. These workers, emboldened by Rosa's bravery, began to share their own stories of injustice, unpaid wages, unsafe conditions, and the silent disappearance of those who dared to speak out. "They've been stitching their own tapestry of lies for years," Marta said, her voice firm. "Now it's time to unravel it." As Rosa's network grew, so did the tension in the town. Mr. Hammond, desperate to regain control, sent men to confiscate the tapestries displayed in the merchants' shops. But Rosa was always one step ahead. She and Marta began creating smaller pieces, handkerchiefs, pillowcases, and even patches that could be easily hidden and circulated among the workers. Each piece carried a message, a symbol of solidarity, a fragment of a ledger, or a cryptic pattern pointing to the Hammonds' misdeed. The movement became known as the Thread, and it wasn't long before whispers of its impact reached even the magistrate. One cold afternoon, a knock at the Alvarez door startled Rosa from her work. Gabriel answered, only to find a young man clutching a bundle of fabric. His face was pale, his hands trembling. "They took my sister," he stammered, his voice thick with fear. "She spoke out about the mill conditions and now she's gone. Please, you have to help." Rosa's heart ached at the desperation in his eyes. She turned to Marta, who nodded solemnly. "The Hammonds are tightening their grip," Marta said, "but the tighter they hold, the more will slip through their fingers." Rosa didn't hesitate. "We'll find her," she said, determination hardening her voice. Their search led them to the outskirts of town, to a crumbling warehouse used to store surplus goods from the mill. Inside, Rosa and Marta found not only the young woman, but several other workers who had been locked away to keep them from speaking out. The sight of their gaunt faces and pleading eyes lit a fire in Rosa she hadn't known was there. "This ends now," she whispered, her voice trembling with fury. That night, Rosa and Marta worked tirelessly, weaving the story of the missing workers into a new tapestry. It was their boldest piece yet, depicting the warehouse, the locked doors, and the faces of those imprisoned within. The patterns were woven with precision, leaving no doubt about the Hammonds' culpability. The tapestry was unveiled at a public meeting called by the magistrate. Rosa stood before the crowd, her hands trembling but her voice steady as she recounted the stories of those who had suffered under the Hammonds' reign. "These threads are their voices," Rosa said, gesturing to the tapestry. "Voices that deserve to be heard." The crowd erupted in outrage. The magistrate, faced with overwhelming evidence and public pressure, ordered an investigation into the mill's practices. Rosa's bravery had sparked a fire that couldn't be extinguished, and for the first time, the Hammonds were truly on the defensive. Late that night, Marta and Rosa sat together in the courtyard, exhaustion etched into their faces. "You've done something remarkable," Marta said, her voice soft. "But this fight isn't over." "I know," Rosa replied, her gaze fixed on the stars. "But it's worth it." The tension in the town reached a breaking point. The magistrate's investigation began uncovering damning evidence against Mr. Hammond, but the mill owner, embittered and desperate, refused to yield. He doubled down on his intimidation tactics, sending his men to raid homes, confiscate embroidery bearing Rosa's designs, and threaten workers who spoke out. Despite this, the thread continued to grow. Rosa's tapestries, once admired for their artistry, had become emblems of defiance. The entire town seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable clash between the Hammonds' corruption and the voices of those who had endured it for too long. One freezing morning, Rosa awoke to find the Alvarez home ransacked. Her tapestries were gone, her embroidery threads scattered across the floor like discarded dreams. Gabriel sat on the bed, his face pale and drawn. "They came last night," he said quietly. "Took everything. They said if you didn't stop, they'd burn the house." Rosa's hands clenched into fists, anger rising in her chest like a wildfire. "They think this will silence me?" she said, her voice trembling. "They're wrong." Her grandmother, frail and bent with age, shuffled into the room. She placed a trembling hand on Rosa's shoulder. "Sometimes, Nina, the loudest voice is the one that refuses to break." That evening, Rosa met Marta in their usual spot behind the market. The older woman's face was grim, her eyes sharp with determination. "They've overplayed their hand," Marta said. "The magistrate is furious about the raids. He's demanding a public hearing in the town square. This is your chance, Rosa." Rosa hesitated. "What if they don't believe me? What if they twist the truth again?" "They might," Marta admitted. "But the truth isn't just in your words anymore. It's in the stitches, the symbols, the stories you've already told. You've given the town something to believe in. Now you must give them a reason to fight." The day of the hearing dawned cold and gray. Rosa stood at the edge of the square, her heart pounding as a crowd began to gather. Workers, merchants, and townsfolk filled the space, their faces a mixture of curiosity and quiet fury. At the center of it all stood the magistrate, flanked by Mr. Hammond and a small group of mill overseers. Rosa clutched a bundle of fabric in her hands, a hastily stitched banner bearing the words, "Truth is a thread that cannot be cut." Gabriel stood beside her, his small hand gripping hers tightly. "You're not alone," he whispered. His words gave her strength. When the hearing began, the magistrate addressed the crowd, outlining the accusations against Mr. Hammond. The mill owner, ever the shrewd businessman, painted himself as a victim of malicious rumors. He dismissed the allegations as nonsense, stitched by a disgruntled servant. Rosa stepped forward, her voice clear and unwavering. "I am that servant," she said, holding up her banner. "And these aren't rumors, they're truths, woven into every thread." She unfurled the tapestry Marta had helped her finish the night before, a sprawling, intricate piece that combined all the evidence they had gathered. The crowd gasped as they took in the symbols of ledger accounts, the faces of missing workers, and the detailed depiction of the warehouse where they had been held. "Everything you see here," Rosa continued, her voice growing stronger, "comes from what I live, what I saw, and what I heard. The mill is built on the backs of those who suffer in silence, but we won't be silent anymore." The square erupted in murmurs, the crowd surging forward to see the tapestry more closely. Mr. Hammond's face darkened, his calm veneer cracking. "This is ridiculous!" he bellowed. "She's a liar, a thief. That tapestry proves nothing." But the magistrate raised a hand, silencing him. "I've seen enough," he said. "This tapestry confirms the testimonies I've received. Your accounts will be seized and reviewed, Mr. Hammond. Until then, the mill will be shut down." The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices a powerful tide that drowned out Mr. Hammond's protests. Rosa stood tall, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and triumph. For the first time, the weight of injustice began to lift, As the crowd dispersed, Marta approached Rosa, her face alight with pride. "You did it," she said softly. "You pulled every thread until the whole thing unraveled." Rosa smiled faintly, exhaustion settling over her. "It's not over," she said. "There are still workers who need help, families who've lost too much." "No," Marta agreed, "it's not over. But you've given them something they didn't have before. Hope." That night, Rosa returned home to find her grandmother waiting by the fire. The old woman's eyes glistened with tears as she pulled Rosa into a tight embrace. "You've done more than clear your name, Nina," she said. "You've given this town its voice." Rosa rested her head on her grandmother's shoulder, the flickering firelight casting shadows on the walls. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to breathe, to feel the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had made a difference. The aftermath of the hearing sent shockwaves through the town. News of Mr. Hammond's disgrace traveled quickly, and while the mill remained closed under the magistrate's orders, Rosa's victory had lit a fire in the hearts of the workers. For the first time in years, they spoke openly of their grievances, their courage buoyed by her defiance. But victory, Rosa realized, was not without cost. The Hammonds were bitter enemies, and their influence extended beyond the walls of the mill. Rosa's fight was far from over. One cold, misty morning, Rosa awoke to an urgent knock at the door. Gabriel rushed to answer it, only to find Marta standing there, her expression unusually grim. In her hands, she held a crumpled piece of paper. "They're coming after you," Marta said without preamble, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. "Hammond's overseers are spreading lies, saying you forged the tapestry, that you planted false evidence. They want to turn the magistrate against you." Rosa's heart sank. "How can they? The evidence is right there. Everyone saw it." Marta placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Truth doesn't scare them, Rosa. Your voice does. They'll twist the truth, bury it if they can, but they can't erase what you've started. We won't let them." Rosa's resolve hardened. "What do we do?" "We finish this," Marta replied. "Once and for all." Marta's plan was bold, almost reckless. They would gather the workers and townspeople for one final stand, a public demonstration in the square. It wasn't just about Rosa's innocence anymore. It was about exposing the entire system of corruption and exploitation that had plagued the town for years. Word spread quickly, and the workers responded with fervor. Families who had suffered under the Hammonds' greed came forward, offering testimonies, documents, and even ledgers smuggled out of the mill. Each piece of evidence became another thread in the tapestry of justice Rosa and Marta were weaving. As the day of the demonstration approached, Rosa worked tirelessly on a new piece, a banner large enough to cover the town hall's steps. It was bold and unflinching, its design featuring images of the missing fabric, the imprisoned workers, and the stolen wealth funneled into the Hammonds' accounts. At the center was a simple but powerful message. The thread of justice is stronger than fear. Marta watched as Rosa stitched the final letters, her voice soft with admiration. "You've come so far, child. From a girl accused to a woman who inspires." Rosa looked up, her eyes shining with determination. "I couldn't have done it alone." The morning of the demonstration was bitterly cold, but the square was filled with warmth. Hundreds of people gathered, their breath visible in the frosty air, their faces resolute. Rosa stood at the front, flanked by Marta, Gabriel, and a small group of workers who had risked everything to bring the truth to light. The magistrate arrived shortly after, his expression serious as he took in the size of the crowd. Mr. Hammond was not far behind, his face flushed with anger and defiance. He approached the magistrate, his voice loud enough to carry through the square. "This is an outrage!" Hammond shouted. "These are lies, spread by a disgruntled servant and her band of thieves. You can't possibly—" "Enough," the magistrate said, cutting him off. His gaze shifted to Rosa. "You've gathered us here, Rosa. Speak." Rosa stepped forward, the banner unfurled behind her. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, but she stood tall. "This town deserves better," she began, her voice steady. "For too long, the Hammonds have profited from our suffering. They've stolen from us, silenced us, and left us to bear the weight of their greed. But we are not silent anymore." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices echoing through the square. Rosa raised her hand, and the noise quieted. "This banner," she continued, gesturing to the tapestry behind her, "is not just a piece of cloth. It's our story, woven from our pain, our strength, and our hope. We will not let them erase it." The magistrate examined the banner closely, his expression unreadable. Rosa's heart pounded as she waited for his response. Finally, he turned to Hammond, his voice firm. "The evidence is overwhelming. Your actions have caused irreparable harm to this town. I have no choice but to order the seizure of your estate and the redistribution of your assets to those you've wronged." Hammond's face turned ashen, his protests drowned out by the roar of the crowd. Workers embraced one another, their joy and relief palpable. Rosa felt a wave of emotion wash over her, but she held her composure, knowing the fight wasn't just hers. It belonged to all of them. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Rosa and Marta stood together in the quiet of the courtyard. The banner now hung proudly across the town hall, a symbol of their victory. "You've changed this town," Marta said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've shown them what one voice can do." Rosa smiled faintly, her gaze fixed on the banner. "It wasn't just one voice. It was all of ours." Marta nodded, her expression softening. "And the thread you've woven? It'll hold strong for generations." The square, once a place of silence and resignation, had become a beacon of resilience. The townsfolk, emboldened by Rosa's victory, came together to rebuild what the Hammonds had broken. For weeks after the demonstration, laughter and the hum of sewing machines filled the air as workers crafted banners, quilts, and tapestries inspired by Rosa's story. Rosa, though relieved, felt the weight of exhaustion. Her hands were raw from weeks of stitching and her voice hoarse from rallying the people, but her spirit remained unbroken. Marta, always by her side, urged her to rest. "You've done enough for now," Marta said one afternoon as they sat in the warmth of Rosa's grandmother's kitchen. "The town will carry the rest." "I'm not sure I know how to stop," Rosa admitted, her fingers tracing invisible stitches on the table. "There's still so much to fix." Her grandmother, stirring a pot of soup nearby, chimed in. "A thread can't hold forever, Rosa. It needs to rest before it frays." Rosa smiled faintly. The image of her life as a fragile, stretched thread felt fitting, but there was comfort in knowing it had not snapped. In the weeks that followed, the magistrate continued to oversee the redistribution of the Hammonds' wealth. The estate's funds were used to repair the mill and establish safer working conditions, and a small fund was created to compensate the families who had suffered under the Hammonds' cruelty. Rosa watched these changes with cautious optimism. The town's gratitude was overwhelming. People often stopped her in the street to thank her or offer small tokens of appreciation. A loaf of bread, a scarf, a kind word. Yet she struggled to accept their praise fully. The fight, she knew, had cost more than it should have. One evening, Gabriel came home with a bundle under his arm. "For you," he said, placing it in her lap. Rosa opened the bundle to reveal a bolt of fabric, soft, pristine, and far finer than anything she'd ever worked with. A small note was tucked inside. "Every stitch has a story. Tell yours." Her heart swelled as she read the words. "Who gave this to you?" she asked. "Mrs. Alcott, the merchant's wife," Gabriel replied. "She said your work deserves the finest canvas." Encouraged by Marta, Rosa began working on a new tapestry. This one wasn't a weapon or a rallying cry. It was a reflection, a story of what had been endured and overcome. Thread by thread, she wove the faces of the townsfolk, the symbols of the mill, and the quiet triumph of justice. Marta visited often, watching Rosa work. "What will you call it?" she asked one evening. Rosa thought for a moment, her hands stilling on the fabric. "The threads of the innocent," she said softly. "For those who spoke when they were told to be silent. For those who fought when they were told to give up." Marta smiled, her eyes glistening. "It's perfect." As the tapestry neared completion, the magistrate invited Rosa to unveil it in a formal ceremony at the newly reopened mill. The day arrived clear and bright, the air humming with anticipation. Workers and townsfolk filled the space, their faces alight with pride. Rosa stood at the front, her heart pounding as she pulled back the curtain to reveal her creation. The tapestry shimmered in the sunlight, its intricate design capturing the spirit of the town, the struggles, the victories, and the enduring strength of its people. The crowd erupted into applause, but Rosa's gaze sought Marta, who stood off to the side, her face beaming with pride. For a moment, their eyes met, and no words were needed. Later that evening, Rosa and Marta returned to the courtyard behind Rosa's home. The quiet was soothing after the excitement of the day. Marta, her voice gentle, broke the silence. "You've given this town something no one else could. They'll remember you for generations." Rosa shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. "They'll remember us. Every stitch, every story. It was always about all of us." Marta chuckled softly. "You're wiser than your years, Nina, but promise me you'll rest now." Rosa nodded. "I will. Tomorrow." Months passed, and the town began to heal. The mill reopened under new ownership, a cooperative formed by the workers themselves. The changes were slow but meaningful. Safer conditions, fair wages, and a sense of shared pride. The shadow of the Hammonds lingered, but it no longer loomed as darkly. Justice, though imperfect, had left its mark. For Rosa, life took on a quieter rhythm. Her tapestries became renowned far beyond the town, commissioned by merchants and dignitaries who marveled at her ability to weave not just images, but emotions into her work. Yet she remained humble, often refusing grand offers to focus on pieces that told the stories of ordinary people, workers, mothers, and children who carried unseen burdens. One evening, as Rosa walked home from the market, she passed the newly refurbished mill. The sound of laughter and machinery filled the air, a melody of progress. She paused to watch the workers inside, their movements steady and purposeful. A wave of pride swept over her, but it was tinged with something deeper, a quiet yearning for all the voices that hadn't lived to see this day. At home, she found Marta sitting in the courtyard, her hands busy with a simple patchwork quilt. The older woman's face, though lined with age, held a piece Rosa hadn't seen before. "You're restless," Marta said without looking up. Rosa sat beside her, sighing. "It feels unfinished, like there's still more to do." Marta smiled, her needle pulling a vibrant thread through the fabric. "There's always more to do, Rosa, but sometimes finishing isn't the point. It's about what you've started." As the evening deepened, Gabriel joined them, carrying a small wooden box. "I found this in the attic," he said, placing it between them. Rosa opened it carefully, revealing a collection of her earliest embroidery pieces, simple designs stitched onto scraps of fabric, many of them frayed and faded. She held one up, a clumsy pattern of flowers that brought a soft laugh to her lips. "I was so proud of this," she said. "I thought it was perfect." "It was," Marta replied, "for who you were then. And look at what you've done since." Rosa ran her fingers over the stitching, the memories flooding back. Each piece was a chapter of her story, a testament to the growth, pain, and triumph that had shaped her. She set the fabric down gently, her gaze drifting to the stars. The following week, Rosa unveiled her final tapestry in the town square. Unlike her previous works, this piece was a gift, not a commission, a thank you to the people who had stood with her, who had fought for justice and dared to dream of something better. The tapestry depicted a sprawling tree, its roots deep and strong, its branches reaching skyward. Hidden within the design were the names of workers, townsfolk, and even Marta herself, each one a thread in the fabric of their shared story. When the curtain fell, the crowd erupted into applause, but Rosa stepped back, letting the moment belong to the town. Her heart swelled as she saw children pointing to their parents' names, elders smiling at the symbols that honored their struggles. This, she realized, was the legacy she had fought for, not fame or fortune, but connection. That night, as the square emptied and the stars lit up the sky, Rosa sat quietly with Marta on the steps of the town hall. The older woman's hand rested on hers, their bond unspoken but deeply felt. "You've done enough, Nina," Marta said softly, her voice filled with pride. "Now, it's time to let the next generation weave their own stories." Rosa nodded, her heart full, but at peace. "Maybe, but I'll always have more threads to sew." Marta chuckled, her eyes twinkling. "That's the spirit." In the years that followed, Rosa continued to create, her tapestries gracing homes, halls, and galleries far beyond the town. Yet she never forgot where it began, on the floor of a mill, with a needle, a thread, and an unyielding belief in her innocence. Her work became a symbol of resilience, her name spoken with reverence. But Rosa herself remained humble, always attributing her success to the people who had shaped her journey. In the end, her greatest masterpiece was not a tapestry, but the community she had helped to rebuild, a patchwork of lives stitched together by hope, truth, and the courage to stand against injustice. If Rosa's journey of resilience, courage, and hope moved you, subscribe to HeroKind Stories and leave a comment. Share her story with those who believe in the power of unity and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Together, let's weave a future where every thread tells a story worth remembering.